By August 1943, Allied medical staff had begun noticing a pattern they didn't discuss openly. Evacuation hospitals in Sicily were filling with men who had no visible wounds, no shrapnel damage, no burns, no fractures. They arrived conscious, mobile, capable of speech, but they could not return to combat. The official term was combat exhaustion. The unofficial reality was more complicated. Some soldiers shook continuously. Others stared without focusing. A few became violent when approached. Most simply refused orders to move forward. The symptoms varied, but the institutional response was consistent. Document, stabilize, evacuate rearward. To medical officers, this was expected. Modern war produced psychological casualties at rates that exceeded previous conflicts. The pace of combat in North Africa and Sicily had been relentless. Units rotated poorly. Rest was irregular. The human cost of sustained operations was appearing in forms that couldn't be stitched or sedated. To one American general, it looked different. He had been visiting field hospitals regularly, not for publicity, but for assessment. He watched how men moved through triage. He listened to how doctors categorized injuries. And he had started asking questions that made medical staff uncomfortable. How many of these men had been under fire when they broke? How many had witnessed others break first? How many had been removed from units where morale was already compromised? The questions weren't clinical, they were operational. On August 3rd, he entered the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He moved through the wards methodically, stopping at beds, asking brief questions. His aide followed. So did the hospital's receiving officer. When he reached a soldier sitting on a bed with no visible injury, he stopped longer than usual. The conversation that followed would be reported differently by every witness present. But no one disagreed on what happened next. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favor, tap like, so this story isn't buried. Show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The campaign in Sicily had exposed something Allied command hadn't wanted to confirm. American forces were still learning how to sustain pressure. North Africa had shown flashes of competence alongside catastrophic failures. Kasserine Pass had been a collapse, not of firepower, but of cohesion. Units had broken contact. Officers had lost situational awareness. Retreat had spread faster than German advance. The outcome wasn't defeat in battle. It was disintegration under stress. After Kasserine, the institutional response was predictable. Better intelligence, better coordination, better equipment, all correct, all insufficient. One commander had drawn a different conclusion. The problem wasn't tactical, it was behavioral. He had studied armies that fell apart before they were beaten. The French in 1940, the Italians in Libya. The pattern was consistent. Once hesitation became acceptable, it multiplied. Once withdrawal was rationalized, it repeated. Collapse didn't require overwhelming force. It required the belief that collapse was inevitable. His response was to eliminate the space where that belief could form. In his command, there was no ambiguity about appearance. Uniforms were maintained under all conditions. Helmets were worn. Salutes were enforced, not because tradition mattered, but because visible disorder preceded invisible disorder. Sloppiness in appearance correlated with sloppiness in execution. If men stopped caring how they looked, they would stop caring how they fought. Movement was constant. Units didn't wait for perfect information. They moved on available information and adapted while moving. Hesitation was treated as more dangerous than error. A wrong decision executed immediately was preferable to a correct decision delayed. The enemy could counter mistakes. They couldn't counter speed. Orders were short and absolute. Explanations were rare. Questions were discouraged. This wasn't cruelty. It was compression. Under fire, the time between order and execution determined survival. Units that debated didn't last. Units that moved immediately had a chance. The results in Sicily confirmed his approach. His forces had advanced faster than planned. They had covered terrain that intelligence assessments said would take days, finishing in hours. German units attempting organized withdrawal found themselves overrun before defensive positions were prepared. Roads became kill zones. Timetables collapsed. German after-action reports noted something unfamiliar. American pressure that didn't pause. But speed has internal costs that don't appear in operational summaries. Men pushed beyond normal limits don't recover on schedule. Sleep deprivation accumulates. Stress responses compound. The body eventually overrides command authority. Some men simply stop functioning. By late July, field hospitals were processing two categories of casualties: those injured by enemy action and those incapacitated by the pace of friendly action. To medical staff, this was a known variable. Every army operating at high tempo produced psychiatric casualties. The British called it shell shock. The Germans called it Kriegsneurose. The Americans called it combat exhaustion. The terminology varied. The phenomenon didn't. Standard procedure was straightforward. Remove the affected soldier from the front, provide rest and stabilization, evaluate for return to duty. Most recovered within days. Some required evacuation to rear hospitals. A small percentage were permanently unfit for combat. The system treated this as mechanical. Break occurs, remove component, repair or replace. To one commander, the system was producing the wrong incentive. If leaving the front line was medicalized, it became acceptable. If breaking under pressure was categorized as injury rather than failure, it spread. Men didn't need to be conscious cowards. They just needed to see that breaking was tolerated. The threshold would lower. The rate would increase. He believed morale was binary. Either a unit believed it would hold or it didn't. There was no stable middle state. Units that began doubting themselves accelerated toward collapse. The only way to prevent that acceleration was to eliminate doubt as an option. This meant fear had to be treated as contagious. Not enemy fire. Everyone understood that risk. But internal fear. The fear of one's own reaction. The fear of breaking in front of others. That fear, once visible, validated itself. If one man broke and was evacuated without consequence, others would follow. Not because they wanted to, because the possibility had been demonstrated. His calculation was cold. A small number of men visibly punished for psychological collapse would prevent a larger number from reaching that state. The logic was consistent with his broader philosophy. Discipline prevented casualties. Appearance prevented disorder. Speed prevented encirclement. And fear, if directed correctly, prevented cowardice. The problem was where that logic led. By early August, his visits to evacuation hospitals had changed tone. He wasn't inspecting facilities. He was hunting for patterns. How many men with no wounds were being evacuated? Which units were they from? Had those units seen combat recently, or had they broken before contact? Medical officers grew uncomfortable with the questions. Their role was treatment, not judgment. A soldier presenting with uncontrollable tremors, inability to eat, or catatonic episodes was a casualty regardless of cause. The distinction between physical and psychological trauma was medical, not moral. But to a commander who believed survival depended on collective will, the distinction was absolute. Physical wounds were proof of combat. Psychological wounds were proof of insufficient discipline. When he entered that hospital on August 3rd, he wasn't looking for injured men. He was looking for weakness that hadn't been corrected. The 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia was operating beyond capacity. Wounded from the previous week's fighting filled every bed. Additional casualties were being staged on stretchers in the receiving area. Medical staff moved quickly, triaging based on survivability. The surgical tent ran continuously. The air smelled like disinfectant, blood, and summer heat. The general entered without announcement. He moved through the wards asking brief questions: name, unit, injury. He didn't linger on responses. His aide stayed 2 steps behind. The hospital's receiving officer accompanied them, answering procedural questions when asked. Near the back of the tent, a soldier sat on a cot. No bandages, no visible damage. His uniform was intact. He stared forward without focusing on anything specific. The general stopped. "What's your problem?" The soldier looked up slowly. His response was quiet, barely audible over the noise of the ward. "It's my nerves, sir." "Your nerves?" The soldier nodded. The general's expression changed. Not to anger, not yet. To something colder. "What did you say?" "I can't take it anymore, sir." There was a pause. Medical staff nearby slowed their movements, attention shifting toward the conversation. "You're a disgrace." The general's voice rose, not shouting, but loud enough that adjacent beds could hear clearly. "You sit here while men are dying. You're a coward." The soldier didn't respond. He continued staring forward, breathing unevenly. The general stepped closer. What happened next occurred in seconds, but every witness would remember it with unusual clarity. The general struck the soldier across the face with his hand. Once, then again. "Get back to the front." Medical staff froze. The receiving officer moved forward slightly, then stopped. The general's aide remained motionless. The soldier began crying, not loudly. His shoulders shook, head down, hands gripping the edge of the cot. The general turned and walked toward the exit. His aide followed. The receiving officer stayed behind, uncertain of protocol. The soldier remained on the cot, surrounded by witnesses, who now had to decide what they had just seen. 1 week later, it happened again. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital, August 10th. Different location. Similar circumstances. The general was conducting another inspection. Another ward full of wounded. Another soldier with no visible injury. This time, witnesses were more numerous. Nurses, doctors, patients in adjacent beds. The hospital commander was present. The conversation followed the same pattern. "What's wrong with you?" "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling." The response was immediate. "Your nerves?" "I won't have cowards in my army." The general struck the soldier, once across the face, then grabbed him by the collar and shook him. "You're going back to the front. You're going to fight." The soldier pulled away, stumbling backward. The general followed, raising his hand again. Then he reached for his pistol. He didn't draw it fully. He didn't aim it. But his hand went to the holster, fingers on the grip, the motion visible to everyone present. A medical officer stepped between them. "Sir, this man is a patient." The general stopped. His hand remained on the pistol for another moment, then dropped. He turned to the hospital commander. "I won't have these cowards here. Check every man without wounds. If they can't fight, send them to the rear where they belong." Then he left. The soldier was led away by medical staff. The hospital commander remained standing in the center of the tent, surrounded by witnesses who were already understanding that what had just occurred was not containable. By that evening, written reports were being prepared, not immediately, not reflexively, but carefully. Medical officers consulted each other about procedure. What was the chain of command for reporting an incident involving a general officer? Who had authority to intervene? What constituted appropriate documentation? The delay wasn't cowardice. It was institutional paralysis. No one present doubted what they had seen. But translating observation into official complaint required bypassing normal hierarchy. It meant accusing a successful combat commander of conduct unbecoming. It meant risking career consequences for protecting a single enlisted man diagnosed with combat exhaustion. The second incident removed that paralysis. The presence of the pistol changed the calculus. Physical discipline was one thing. The threat of a weapon crossed into territory that couldn't be ignored. If unreported, the next incident might escalate further. If reported, institutional response was unavoidable. Within 48 hours, written accounts reached the medical command structure. Within 72 hours, they reached the theater commander. Within 1 week, they reached Washington. The incident had left the realm of command discretion. It had become a political problem, not because of what happened. Armies had long histories of harsh discipline. Soldiers had been struck by officers before. Combat stress had been misunderstood and mishandled in every war. But this had occurred in a hospital, in front of medical staff, with witnesses who had documentation responsibilities. And the officer involved was too visible, too successful, and too controversial to handle quietly. The slapping itself was containable. The publicity was not. By late August, journalists embedded with Allied forces had heard rumors. Not official reports, those were classified. But medical personnel talked. Soldiers talked. The story spread through unofficial channels faster than official ones. Reporters began asking questions, quietly at first, then more directly. Was it true that a general had struck enlisted men? Was it true this happened in a hospital? Was it true he had drawn a weapon? The theater command faced a choice: confirm and control the narrative, or deny and let speculation spread. They chose control. On August 17th, the general was summoned. He was informed that his actions were under official review. He was ordered to apologize, not privately, but publicly, in front of the units involved, in front of witnesses. The message was clear. Success did not grant immunity. The apology occurred over several days. Different units, different locations. Each time, the general read from prepared remarks. Each time, soldiers stood in formation and listened to a commander admit fault. The humiliation was deliberate, but it wasn't punishment. Not yet. Punishment came in the form of silence. No new orders, no command assignments, no operational role. He remained in theater. He retained his rank. But he was no longer leading troops. To outside observers, it looked like accountability. To anyone watching closely, it looked like quarantine. The war was about to enter its most critical phase. Commanders were being selected for the invasion of France. Reputations were being assessed. Political viability was being calculated. And one general, despite his results in Sicily, was now too dangerous to deploy. Not because he had failed, because he had succeeded in a way that couldn't be defended publicly. The official reprimand arrived on August 17th, but the real punishment began 3 days later. No formal announcement was made. No public statement explained the change. But across Allied command, a shift occurred that everyone noticed and no one acknowledged directly. The general's name stopped appearing in operational planning documents. Meetings continued without him. Strategy sessions proceeded in his absence. When senior commanders discussed the next phase of the war, his assignment was not mentioned. The silence was louder than any court-martial could have been. To those outside the command structure, nothing appeared wrong. He remained in theater. He retained his rank and his staff. Photographs still showed him inspecting equipment, reviewing maps, meeting with subordinates. The appearance of authority continued. But authority without assignment is decoration. His units were quietly reassigned. Division commanders who had reported to him began receiving orders from different sources. The staff officers who had implemented his operational tempo found themselves preparing plans for other generals to execute. The system was disaggregating his command without formally removing it. This was not accidental. Court-martial would have been cleaner, but politically impossible. The general had delivered results. Sicily had been taken ahead of schedule. Casualties had been lower than projected. German forces had been disrupted more thoroughly than intelligence had predicted. Those outcomes were documented and impossible to erase. Firing him would require explaining why success was being punished. That explanation would expose the slapping incident more widely. It would force public debate about combat stress, military discipline, and command authority at exactly the moment Allied leadership needed unified messaging about the coming invasion of France. So the solution was administrative. Remove him from operations without removing him from the theater. Maintain the appearance of continuity while eliminating his influence. Let time and bureaucracy accomplish what direct action could not. The calculation was clear. He was too effective to discard entirely, but too volatile to deploy freely. Within 2 weeks, another consequence emerged. Journalists who had been hearing rumors finally received enough confirmation to publish. The stories were careful. They didn't name the general initially. Military censorship prevented that. But they described a senior American commander who had struck hospitalized soldiers. They quoted anonymous medical staff. They raised questions about leadership and accountability. By early September, the censorship collapsed. His name appeared in print. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some editorial boards called for his removal. They framed the incident as abuse of power, as cruelty toward men suffering from invisible wounds. They argued that no military success justified striking a defenseless soldier in a hospital. Others defended him. They argued that war required harsh discipline, that combat exhaustion was being overdiagnosed, that squeamishness about command authority would cost lives. They pointed to his results in Sicily as evidence that his methods worked. The debate was sharp, emotional, and entirely beside the point. What mattered wasn't public opinion. What mattered was political calculation at the highest levels. The Allied coalition was fragile. British and American command relationships were tense. Public support for the war required belief that soldiers were being led competently and humanely. Any suggestion of abuse, regardless of context, threatened that support. The general had become a liability not because of what he did, but because of what explaining it would require. So the sidelining continued. By October, his headquarters staff had been reduced. By November, his operational role had been eliminated entirely. He was given ceremonial duties, inspections, reviews, visits to hospitals, ironic given the circumstances, where he was photographed shaking hands with wounded soldiers. The message being sent was subtle but unmistakable. Success had limits, and he had found them. Inside Allied command, reactions varied. Some officers were relieved. They had found his methods extreme, his pace unsustainable, his disregard for procedure dangerous. To them, the slapping incident confirmed what they had suspected. He was undisciplined, uncontrollable, and eventually bound to create a larger problem. Others were frustrated. They had seen his results firsthand. They knew that his units performed differently, moved faster, disrupted enemy operations more thoroughly. They believed the incident was being used as justification for removing someone who made slower, more cautious commanders uncomfortable by comparison. But no one argued publicly. The decision had been made at levels where debate was not invited. What no one anticipated was how the enemy would interpret his absence. German intelligence had been tracking Allied command structures carefully. They monitored which generals were assigned to which sectors. They noted patterns of movement, concentrations of forces, and changes in operational tempo. When this particular general disappeared from active command, they noticed immediately. His formations had moved differently in Sicily, faster, more aggressively, less predictably. German units facing him had reported constant pressure, disrupted withdrawals, collapsed timetables. He was not the only competent American commander, but he was distinctive. When he vanished from the order of battle, German analysts began asking questions. Where was he? If removed from command entirely, why was he still in theater? If still in theater, but not commanding, what was he doing? The simplest explanation, that he had been sidelined for disciplinary reasons, was briefly considered and rejected. Competent commanders were not wasted over administrative problems during active war. If the Allies had removed him from combat operations, there had to be a larger reason. The conclusion formed quickly. He was being held in reserve for something more important. By December 1943, German intelligence assessments began referencing him as a potential indicator of Allied invasion planning. If he reappeared in command, it would signal where the main effort was being prepared. His absence wasn't evidence of disgrace. It was evidence of concealment. That belief would persist for months. It would influence German defensive planning. It would affect where reserves were positioned. It would create delays in response time when the actual invasion began. All because they assumed competence would not be wasted. They were wrong about his role, but they were correct about his capability. And that assumption, that the Allies would not sideline effectiveness over something trivial, gave the sidelined general more influence than his defenders could have anticipated. Back in Allied command, none of this was visible yet. What was visible was a general without a command, results without redemption, and success that had been retroactively reframed as liability. The apologies had been delivered. The reprimands had been issued. The reassignments had been completed. But the war continued, and wars have a way of revealing who becomes indispensable regardless of what they've done. The question was no longer whether he would return to command. The question was whether his return would prove the punishment wrong, or confirm that some problems solve themselves when the situation becomes desperate enough. For now, the answer was administrative silence. He remained in theater. He remained ranked. He remained sidelined. And across the channel, the enemy remained convinced he was being saved for something decisive. By January 1944, the general had been effectively invisible for 4 months. He attended ceremonies. He inspected training units. He delivered scripted remarks at events designed to demonstrate Allied unity. His face appeared in photographs alongside other commanders, always positioned carefully. Present, but not central. Visible, but not prominent. To anyone tracking Allied command structures, the message was clear. He had been defanged. German intelligence continued tracking him anyway. Their assessment hadn't changed. A commander with his record didn't disappear unless he was being repositioned. The longer he remained absent from active operations, the more convinced they became that his eventual deployment would mark something significant. By March, German defensive planning in northern France had begun incorporating him as a variable. Not where he was, they didn't know, but where he might appear. Analysis focused on identifying which invasion beaches would suit his operational style. Fast movement, deep penetration, aggressive exploitation of breakthrough. Calais was the obvious answer, the shortest route across the Channel, the most direct path to Germany, the location where speed and aggression would matter most. If the Allies were planning a major invasion, and if they were holding their most aggressive commander in reserve, Calais made strategic sense. German reserves were positioned accordingly. Divisions that might have reinforced Normandy stayed near Calais. Counterattack plans assumed the main effort would come there. Response times were calculated based on the belief that once the real invasion began, it would move faster than previous Allied operations. None of this was based on signals intelligence. No intercepted communications confirmed his location. No reconnaissance spotted his headquarters. It was based entirely on logic. Competence doesn't get wasted. They were applying their own doctrine to an enemy that operated differently. In the German system, effective commanders were too valuable to sideline over personal conduct. Discipline problems were handled internally and quickly. If an officer produced results, minor infractions were overlooked or quietly corrected. They assumed the Allies functioned the same way. They were wrong. The general remained sidelined, not because the Allies were concealing him, but because they didn't know what to do with him. His effectiveness was undeniable. His political toxicity was equally undeniable. The institution was paralyzed between those contradictions. But paralysis has a time limit in wartime. By April, planning for the invasion of France had reached final stages. Command assignments were being confirmed. Operational roles were being finalized. The question of what to do with the sideline general could no longer be postponed. The decision came from the top. He would return to command. Not immediately, not prominently, but eventually, after the initial landings, when attention had shifted and the scandal had aged enough to stop dominating headlines. The calculation was pragmatic. The invasion would require exploitation once the beachhead was established. Someone would need to push inland fast, disrupt German responses, prevent them from establishing defensive lines. Speed would matter more than caution. And no one moved faster than the general they had spent 6 months containing. On July 6, 1944, 1 month after D-Day, he assumed command of Third Army. Not in time for the landing, not in time for the initial breakthrough, but in time for what came after. Within weeks, Third Army was moving faster than any Allied formation in the theater, across France, through gaps in German lines, bypassing strong points, encircling withdrawing units. The pace was relentless. German units that had expected measured Allied advance found themselves overrun before defensive positions were prepared. Supply lines collapsed. Command structures fractured. Entire divisions were encircled and forced to surrender, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't retreat faster than Third Army advanced. The results vindicated every argument his defenders had made, but they didn't erase what had happened in Sicily. Press coverage of his return was cautious. Reporters mentioned his record, but also referenced past controversies. Editorial boards that had called for his removal now wrote carefully neutral assessments of his performance. The slapping incident was never far from any profile written about him. To the public, he remained complicated. Effective, but troubling. Successful, but flawed. To the enemy, he remained exactly what they had feared. Relentless. By December 1944, Third Army had advanced further and faster than any comparable Allied formation. Casualty ratios favored his forces. Territory captured exceeded projections. Enemy divisions reported constant pressure, inadequate time to regroup, and collapsing morale. But the incident in Sicily was never forgotten. When historians later assessed his career, they would spend as much time analyzing the slapping as analyzing his campaigns. When films depicted him, the hospital scene would be included as prominently as any battle. When military academies taught his operations, they would also teach the consequences of exceeding boundaries. The war remembered his speed. It also remembered his limits. Because the slapping incident had revealed something uncomfortable about modern command. Effectiveness and acceptability were not the same thing. An army could not function if discipline collapsed, but it also could not function if discipline was enforced without restraint. The line between the two was real, even if difficult to locate in advance. He had crossed it. The institution had responded. The war had continued. And in the end, both outcomes proved true simultaneously. The punishment had been justified. His return had been necessary. The slaps had nearly destroyed his career. His methods had helped win the war. The soldiers he struck had suffered invisibly. The soldiers he commanded had survived more frequently than those in comparable units. None of these contradictions resolved cleanly. The general's career ended shortly after Germany's surrender. Not in disgrace, but not in unqualified triumph either. He was celebrated and controversial in equal measure. His tactics were studied. His conduct was criticized. Both assessments were accurate. The incident in Sicily became a case study, not just in military discipline, but in the collision between operational effectiveness and institutional constraints. It demonstrated that wars are not won only by defeating enemies. They are also managed by containing the people fighting them. That even in wartime, there are actions that produce consequences regardless of results. That the most dangerous pressure is not always the kind applied to the enemy. The general believed fear was contagious, and he was correct. What he hadn't accounted for was that fear flows in multiple directions. He feared collapse more than casualties. The institution feared scandal more than stalemate. The soldiers feared both the enemy and the officers driving them forward. All of those fears shaped decisions. All of them had consequences. And when the war ended and the accounting began, the slapping incident remained unresolved. Not because anyone doubted what happened. Everyone agreed on the facts. But because no one could agree on what the facts meant. Was it a failure of character or a product of impossible pressure? Was it an aberration or an inevitability given his methods? Was the punishment evidence of accountability or evidence that institutions prioritize image over function? The questions outlived the war. They outlived the general himself. Because the incident crystallized a tension that exists in every command structure during every conflict. The space between what wins and what's acceptable, between what works and what endures, between the pressure required to break an enemy and the pressure that breaks the person applying it. The general proved that speed, aggression, and relentless pressure could shatter enemy formations. He also proved that those qualities, applied without limit, eventually turn inward. The slaps didn't end his career, but they marked it permanently. And that mark served as a warning, not about weakness, but about strength pushed past the point where it remains useful. In the end, the war didn't need perfect commanders. It needed effective ones who could be contained. He was both. And the cost of being both was that his legacy would never be simple. The incident in Sicily ensured that, not because it defined him, but because it revealed what happened when wartime logic, speed above all, pressure above all, results above all, encountered the reality that even wars have boundaries. And some of those boundaries only become visible after they've been crossed.